I've never been able to latch on to this idea that simply as a woman I transcend national boundaries. You know that Virginia Woolf thing, as a woman I have no country, as a woman I want no country, as a woman my country is the whole world. And I feel that for me as a citizen, a woman citizen of the United States of America, that would be a very easy flight from examining the benefits of my citizenship. And as a citizen of this country, I have had many benefits from my citizenship.
I feel that in fact she might be right. The word nation is no longer useful, that it has been so corrupted by the way in which the states that we live in are organized, that it is no longer possible to use those to mean anything anymore. And where I see an overarching kind of definition of nation that's projected by the state, everywhere I look, I see the ways in which those nation states that we live in are constructed by leaving out. Mm-hmm. So that even as Black people belong geographically and consciously to, let us say, North America and the Caribbean, you can still see a kind of, you can still see where that notion doesn't function for us. Yes. Really well. And in states like in the States and the Caribbean, you can see where the notion doesn't function for women either. And it doesn't function for women here either.
I guess I've just become very mistrustful of all-embracing, enveloping feminist theories, for example, or any kind of theories, really.
No language is neutral. I used to haunt the beach at Guaya. 2 rivers sentinel the country sand. Not buckra white, but nigger brown sand. 1 river dead and teeming from waste and alligators. The other rumbling to the ocean in a tumult. The swift undertow blocking the crossing of little girls, except on the tied-up dress hips of big women. Then the taste of leaving was already on my tongue and cut deep into my skinny, pigeon-toed way. Language here was strict description and teeth-edging truth. Here was beauty, and here was nowhere. There was history, which had taught my eyes to look for escape, even beneath the almond leaves fat as women, the conch shell, tiny as sand, the rock stone, old like water. Leaving this, standing heart and eyes fixed to a skyscraper and a concrete eternity, not knowing then, only running away from something that breaks the heart open and nowhere to live.
Exile is always a major part of Caribbean experience, or maybe it's a major part of Black experience in the West. Exile, feeling not in one's self all the time. So these movements, these passages, these travels are always kind of to yourself or away from yourself. But there's always something missing. Flight is a funny thing anyway. At 17, everybody runs. Canada was simply sort of a new place. And in some ways, that whole notion bought into Canada as this big, vast land of wilderness and so on. So it bought into a kind of Canadian myth of wilderness, which really is not, which the colonizers of Canada brought with them.
$500 and a passport full of sand and winking water is how I reach here. A girl's face shimmering from a little photograph. Her hair between afro and hot comb. Never to pass her eyes on the red-green threads of a hummingbird's twitching back. the blood-warm, quickened watercolors of a seabed, not the rainforest tangled in smoke wet. Well, there it was.
Lillian Smith calls it that she was a white anti-racist woman who died in 1963 and 1963, and she talked about it as the trembling earth under everything in the South. And I came out of that, and growing up in Baltimore, I had certainly been part of that. And to understand what was underneath that trembling earth, to begin to have to locate myself as a white person in the world where this was going on. And of course, wanting to be blameless, wanting to be innocent, wanting to feel that these things were perpetrated by other white people, but that I was already enlightened, righteous, you know.
You have a poem like that, eh?
Yeah.
1900, what is that poem?
Virginia 1906. Yeah. Yeah, about the presumption of one's own innocence if one can criticize, if one can join a movement and say, see, I'm trying to oppose this situation which is evil, but there is none of this in me. I think that that's been a real temptation for white activists in the United States and elsewhere to claim a kind of freedom from our own culpability, our own privilege based on the very system that, you know, we're trying to oppose. And it takes years. I mean, it took me years. Hopefully it doesn't have to take years, but it took me years and on into the women's movement to come to some kind of critical pass where I could really not try to exculpate myself. A dark woman, head bent, listening for something. A woman's voice, a man's voice, or voice of the freeway, night after night. Metals streaming down coast, past eucalyptus, cypress, agribusiness empires. The salad bowl of the world, gur of small plains dusting the strawberries. Each berry picked by a hand in close communion. Strawberry blood on the wrist, malathion in the throat, communion. The democracy that was envisioned was an exclusionary democracy. It was for white males and property people. And we've certainly known of the exclusion of African Americans. I think less vivid and distinct until perhaps sometime in the 60s was the sense of the original people and what was done to them. I think that was the original grain, if you want to call it that.
My relationship to this country is one of like complete antipathy and complete hatred for what it has done, not only outside, but also inside too. And I know that somewhere or other that's irrational, because that's not about people, or even the groups of people who have over the course of its history tried to change it into something else. It is about the groups of people who have tried and succeeded in controlling it and controlling the will of all those people at moments like the Grenada invasion, or at moments like the undermining of the Nicaraguan struggle, or Chile.
Or now with Cuba.
Oh, Cuba.
Yeah.
And at moments inside, too, with disenfranchising of, people, the way in which currently the whole thing about immigration is being played out here against Spanish-speaking people. At those moments, I think, my God, what a hateful place.
Here is a map of our country. Here is the sea of indifference, glazed with salt. This is the haunted river flowing from brow to groin. We dare not taste its water. This is the desert where missiles are planted like corms. This is the breadbasket of foreclosed farms. This is the birthplace of the rockabilly boy. This is the cemetery of the poor who died for democracy. This is a battlefield from a 19th century war. The shrine is famous. This is the sea town of myth and story. When the fishing fleets went bankrupt, here is where the jobs were, on the pier, processing frozen fish sticks, hourly wages, and no shares. I think we feel as though something has happened very much faster than we realized it was going to happen. And then that sort of forces you to look at, you know, what has the right been doing all of this time when the left has been in a kind of disarray. And the right has been very consciously and with great method consolidating power, molding opinion, framing discourse, snatching certain kinds of discourse away from the progressives, renaming everything in this extraordinary Orwellian way.
I have no concept of what it would be like to live from inside and to feel a belonging from inside, some kind of belonging. And to...
This is my country, where all this is going on. This is where I live now. If you had known me once, you'd still know me now, though in a different light and life. This is no place you ever knew me. But it would not surprise you to find me here walking in fog, the sweep of the great ocean eluding me, even the curve of the bay, because, as always, I fix on the land. I am stuck to earth. What I love here is old ranches leaning seaward, low-roofed spreads between rocks, small canyons running through pitched hillsides, live oaks twisted on steepness, the eucalyptus avenue leading to the wrecked homestead, the fog-wreathed, heavy-chested cattle on their blonde hills. I drive inland over roads closed in wet weather, past shacks hunched in the canyons, roads that crawl down into darkness and wind into light, where trucks have crashed and riders of horses tangled to death with low-struck boughs. These are not the roads you knew me by, but the woman driving, walking, watching for life and death is the same. I've been reading a memoir by a German Jewish historian, Felix Gilbert, of living in Germany during the Weimar and then the Nazi periods. And then he, of course, left. And some of the correspondence from his family and friends about, you know, after Hitler was elected, and of course he was elected, there are strong parallels. This is not then, and the United States is not Germany, and I keep reminding myself that historical parallels only work up to a certain point. But I see the same kinds of fears among the population that were fostered by the Nazis, the need for scapegoats, the blaming of economic crisis and disaster on people, groups of people who are supposed to be taking bread from the mouths of the real, quote, citizens.
But there must be a mood that allows that to
There's more than a mood. Appomattox, Wounded Knee, Los Alamos, Selma, the last airlift from Saigon, The ex-army nurse hitchhiking from the debriefing center, medal of spit on the veteran's shoulder. Catch if you can this unbound land, these states without a cause, earth of despoiled graves and grazing, these embittered brooks, these pilgrim ants pouring out from the bronze eyes, ears, nostrils, the mouth of liberty.
One does have a sense that one lives in an American empire and that no other kinds of voices will be entertained. And ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, that sense is even stronger. So that not even the voices of, disenfranchised people in what is called the third world get heard as offering an alternative to how we are all going to live.
We are really looking at an all-embracing global system in which, as you say, the capitalism itself has become the nation.
Yep.
And there is no other nation
and I think
to belong to,
Exactly.
It's like, but then this makes me think of Derek Walcott's line, "My only nation was the imagination."
Well, that's what we have. Right? That's what we have to fall back on, I suppose.
But in the larger sense, that to imagine something different is the task.
In the pale air, overlooking the town, in the anxious dock where sweat and arms are lost already, the ship and the cement drop against the metal skies. A Yankee paratrooper strangles in his sheet. Prayers for rain. Instead, again, this wonderful sky. An evening of the war, and those of us looking with our mouths open see beauty become appalling. Sunset, breaths of gray clouds streaked red. We are watching a house burn. All afternoon and all night. Each night we watch a different fire burn. Tuesday, Butler House. Wednesday, Radio Free, Grenada. Thursday, the police station. A voice at the window looking. The whole damn town should burn. Another. No, too many of us will die. Eyes full of sleep lie awake. We have difficulty eating. What's that to every new sound of the war? It was probably about 59. I was a kid, but I heard about the Cuban Revolution. And the way I heard about the Cuban Revolution was my uncle, who lived in Mayaro, Trinidad, had heard about the Cuban Revolution, had heard about Fidel, coming down from the Sierra Maestra, and got into a fishing boat and went to Cuba to see what was going on. When I began to know what communism meant, that it meant that there was a way out for the masses and masses of people that I knew who lived under, big bosses, under the hot sun, walking with machete from, this place to that place to go work for a big boss, to go cut coconut, to go cut cane, to go work in the oil field every day, not working for themselves. Then it fascinated me more and more why he had done that. And he remains a kind of my metaphor, to just get into a fishing boat at the south of Trinidad,
up and off,
and to go up to Cuba to find out what was going on. It meant to me that there was something in him that needed this rescue, and he must have been hearing about all the talk of freedom for working people, and it must have inspired him to go. And so I just spent the rest of my time, my life in a way, sort of learning more and more about just such an idea. So I became a communist. I became a communist before I even read Marx. In the 5 a.m. cold light, something is missing. Some part of the body, some area of the world, an island, a place to think about. I am walking on the rock of a beach in Barbados, looking to where Grenada was. Now the flight of an American bomber leaves the mark of a rapist in the room. The last evening, the dark and the sky make one. Somewhere, it has disappeared. The hard sky sends military transports. The darkness and my shoulders meet at the neck. No air comes up. We have breathed the last of it. In the Grand Étang, mist and damp, the road to Fedon, fern, sturdy, hesitate, awaiting guerrillas.
First there had been the fascist threat, the Nazi threat, World War II, and then suddenly there was the Soviet threat. And communism came to mean that. And an American communist was a disloyal traitor who basically wanted to sell the United States to the Soviet Union. That idea that you say was sort of the basic idea for you, I never heard communism described in that way until I was older. Europe, 1953. Throughout my random sleepwalk, the words, scratched on walls, on pavements, painted over railway arches, Libérez les Rosenberg. Escaping from home, I found home everywhere. The Jewish question, communism, marriage itself, a question of loyalty or punishment. My Jewish father writing me letters of 17 pages, finely inscribed harangues, questions of loyalty and punishment. 1 week before my wedding, that couple gets the chair. So when you asked me why didn't I join the Communist Party, a lot of reasons. You know, a conceptualizing of it around me, which was almost total. A great deal of fear and a great deal of disillusion on the part of many American communists who had fled the party after the Khrushchev report and in the face of McCarthyism. And it was almost as though there were these two things happening and people saw no way to go except out. She sank, however, into my soul, a weight of sadness. I hardly can register how deep her memory has sunk. That wife and mother, like so many, who seemed to get nothing out of any of it except her children. That daughter of a family, like so many, needing its female monster. She actually wishing to be an artist, wanting out of poverty, possibly also really wanting revolution. That woman strapped in the chair. No fear and no regrets, charged by posterity, not with selling secrets to the communists, but with wanting to distinguish herself, being a bad daughter, a bad mother. And I, walking to my wedding, by the same token a bad daughter, a bad sister, my forces focused on that hardly revolutionary effort. If I have held her at arm's length till now, if I have still believed it was my loyalty, my punishment at stake, if I dare imagine her surviving, I must be fair to what she must have lived through, a separate death, a life unto itself.
All of the language of feminism and of liberation is now commonplace among the very people who continue to control these structures that we live in, who continue to control capitalism all over the world. I doubt very much whether capitalists mean to change women's lives by giving them any sovereignty. Do you know what I mean?
So you're saying that you're pessimistic on those grounds as well as on the grounds that, we were talking last night about the United Nations Conference on Population at Cairo, and that they came forth with a consensus that the solution to that problem was the empowerment and education of women.
You see, I've been just hearing this for the last 20 years about the empowerment and education of women, and women in third world countries need this empowerment and education, etc. And I am not saying that some of that, particularly when it's led by women there, hasn't changed the quality of women's lives there, or haven't helped in looking at the notion of women's oppression. But who controls it alarms me. Because those who control it are not those people who actually want to see the power relations in the world as a whole change, who actually want to see the equal distribution of wealth.
Yes. Yes.
They actually want the introduction of those women into a world capitalist economy, not the equal distribution.
At a certain level.
Precisely.
Yes.
Not the equal distribution of wealth all over the world. They don't have a vision of socialism where one has some control of one's labor, where one's labor is actually worth what it is worth. You see what I mean?
For women's liberation, for genuine women's liberation, there can be no coexistence with capitalism. We're also, I think, have seen that socialism alone will not automatically deliver this. We now have the right calling us feminazis, and claiming that we are threatening to establish some kind of female tyranny. The idea that things could change around women, or that women could change things around us, suggests that a great many other things would have to change, not just around women. That whole systems of relationship would have to change, whole structures of power would have to change. And that is very, very threatening. And in some ways, I think the right has been, in this country, far more alert to the power of feminism than maybe a lot of the feminists themselves.
And the new arguments about how it disenfranchises men to call for your rights. White middle-class men are now victimized by affirmative action and so on.
By all concepts of social justice.
That's kind of funny, isn't it? Pilot was that river I never crossed as a child. A woman, my mother, was weeping on its banks, weeping for the sufferer she would become. She, a too black woman, weeping. Those little girls trailing her footsteps reluctantly and without love for this shaking woman, blood and salt in her mouth, weeping. That river gushed past her feet, blocked her flight. And go where, lady, weeping and go where? Turning back to face herself now, only the oblique shape of something without expectation. Her body composed in doubt. Then she'd come to bend her back to dissemble, then to stand on anger like a ledge, the tilting house, the crazy curtain blazing at her teeth. A woman who thought she was human but got the message, female and black. And somehow those who gave it to her were like family, mother and brother, spitting woman at her. Somehow they were the only place to return to, and this gushing river had already swallowed most of her.
So I remember writing this poem sometime in the 50s, I guess, in which the speaker is a man who is looking at the woman he once loved, who has married somebody else and has been formed and shaped by this institution into someone he both does and does not recognize. And it's a poem that's extremely critical of the institution. But I felt at the time that I had to use the voice of a man. It was the gaze of a man that saw this woman. Of course, it was my gaze.
Right.
It was my seeing of her as she staggers out against the wind to hang clothes on the clothesline.
Right.
And all of her intelligence has been thrown into that stance.
If I look at the poetry that I wrote when there was the suggestion that I was straight, it always had a reluctance in it, or a resistance to roles in it, or something, I mean, I can only look back now and look at it. I cannot say that then I was consciously doing that. I was merely uncomfortable then with something that was going on. And so, and I wrote it in that uncomfortable fashion. Then again, I was, highly preoccupied in early writing with, as I continue to be, with African liberation, or with black liberation. So that became sort of the important thing to write about, and not the personal.
To an extent, it's true in my work too that I was addressing certain political themes, certain themes that were recognized as political, before I was addressing my own desire, which was still seen as a personal issue. But I think that the advantage of that is that you come to that with a sense of the world in which it's being lived out. You don't think of it as something that's happening in private, in a protected space, in a space that can ever be protected. You come to it with that awareness, and you're not trying then to write, romantic love poetry, but it's about women. No one sleeps in this room without the dream of a common language. It was simple to meet you, simple to take your eyes into mine, saying, these are eyes I have known from the first. It was simple to touch you against the hacked background, the grain of what we had been, the choices, years. It was even simple to take each other's lives in our hands as bodies. We learn a lesbian erotic, and that we learn it from women whether or not they're lesbians.
Right. Yeah.
That there are gestures, there are stances, there are female erotic movements in the world, which as very young girls, as little children, we observe, we notice they sink into us subliminally, and we associate this with a woman, not with a woman and a man. What is not simple? To wake from drowning, from where the ocean beat inside us like an afterbirth, into this common, acute particularity, these two selves who walked half a lifetime untouching, to wake to something deceptively simple, a glass sweated with dew, a ring of the telephone, a scream of someone beaten up far down in the street, causing each of us to listen to her own inward scream, knowing the mind of the mugger and the mugged, as any woman must who stands to survive this city, this century, this life.
Looking at the language that we use as writers who are women, about women, and whether we recreate the language of that heterosexuality. In some of the work, there is the sense of the body as really a painful place all the time, because it is always constructed within the confines of heterosexuality, and how that means really about men controlling women, so that one doesn't experience pleasure for oneself. One is a symbol of pleasure for others. And the only ways in which women could exist in many of that work, and work by men and work by women, was as, you know, as mother, in which there were beautiful, like elaborate descriptions, elaborate sensual descriptions of mother and grandmother, etc. But no elaborate and sensual descriptions of woman as sexual for herself. I saw this woman once in another poem, sitting throwing water over her head on the rind of a country beach as she turned toward her century. Seeing her, no part of me was comfortable with itself. I envied her, so old and set aside, a certain habit washed from her eyes. I must have recognized her. I know I watched her along the rim of the surf, promising myself, an old woman is free. In my nerves, something there unraveling. And she was a place to go to, believe me, against gales of masculinity. But in that then, she was masculine. Old woman, old bird, squinting at the water's wing above her head, swearing under her breath. I had a mind that she would be graceful in me, and she might have been, if I had not heard you laughing in another tense and lifted my head from her dry charm. Like, I often wonder, for example, when people talk about Langston Hughes's work and talk about Langston Hughes as being gay, and how Langston Hughes becomes, but Langston Hughes is a sort of major African American poet. So that part of his work that doesn't speak explicitly about his sexuality, which is a great part of his work, how is it infused with his sexuality? Like, do you know what I mean? And so therefore what we are loving, straight and lesbian and gay, about his work.
That's true of so much of all culture that has been made by gay men and by lesbians, whether they were professing that they were or not, whether there were names for that even, you know, when they were doing this. So, I mean, the other side of it is that although there is this heterosexual and heterosexist programming and language and borders and structure, that's all still a very permeable membrane.
Old woman, that was the fragment that I caught in your eye. That was the look I fell in love with, the piece of you that you kept, the piece of you left, the lesbian, the inviolable. There are saints of this ancestry, too, who laugh themselves like jamettes in the pleasure of their legs and caress their sex in mirrors. I have become myself, a woman who looks at a woman and says, "Here, I have found you. In this, I am blackening in my way."
I was hearing women talk about their strong, powerful grandmothers and the role of these grandmothers in the family and matriarchs and so on. And I knew that neither of my grandmothers had been a matriarch. And neither my Jewish grandmother nor my Protestant grandmother. And that they had lived lives which were, you know, relatively privileged because they were white middle-class women, but that they also had not, partly as Southern women, I would have to say, of their era, their generation, and partly just as who they were in the context of their families, never, as you say, never been able to plumb their full capacities. I quote Lillian Smith in the third of those poems. I sort of adopt her as my Southern grandmother, but she was of a later generation than they. And, but she was an anti-racist activist throughout her life. And she was also a terrible anti-communist, I have to say. But she was, for her time and class and, you know, where she came from, she broke with that.
So it's that moment in every woman or something that that I really kind of marvel at. That's true. Even as I understand the casualties, you know.
Because I mean, I think my grandmother was a casualty of all of that, which is not to say...
Was she a powerful figure in her own world, in her own family world, even?
Yes and no. I don't know. You know, I've sort of immortalized her, you know what I mean? But I don't know. Now, more years pass, and as the more the years pass, I wonder if that immortalizing is just in my head. Mm-hmm. Like it must have been some feature of her, I don't know, but...
That you took?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That you could take out and go with?
Yes.
I mean, run with.
The only piece that I didn't feel was going to kill me, because maybe I think there were other pieces that I saw that I thought were killing and that I had to run from like crazy. And that was a lot of things. I think that was domesticity. I think it was heterosexuality. All the pieces that I felt would weaken me, that I saw weaken her. Mm-hmm. I think I fled from all those pieces. Mm-hmm.
I don't want to hear how he beat her after the earthquake, tore up her writing, threw the kerosene lantern into her face, waiting like an unbearable mirror of his own. I don't want to hear how she finally ran from the trailer, how he tore the keys from her hands, jumped into the truck, and backed it into her. I don't want to think how her guesses betrayed her, that he meant well, that she was really the stronger and ought not to leave him to his own apparent devastation. I don't want to know wreckage, dreck, and waste, but these are the materials, and so are the slow lift of the moon's belly over wreckage, dreck, and waste, wild tree frogs calling in another season, light and music still pouring over our fissured, cracked terrain. I had this rebellious feeling that whatever it meant to be a woman, I wanted that, and I wanted to be a poet. Mm-hmm. And somehow I was going to have it all, and I was going to do it. Mm-hmm. And I married quite young, and I had 3 children before I was 30. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of youthful bravura quickly had to look some realities in the face. But I was very guilty a lot of the time, simply because I didn't feel that this was fulfillment for me. And in the 50s, certainly in the white middle class, which I inhabited, such feelings were considered a sign of neurosis, if not psychosis. Mm-hmm. The only help I had was through poetry, when I could write poetry. And I would be writing these little scraps when I had the energy or the time, mm-hmm. putting them in a drawer, and then gradually beginning to realize that they amounted to more than little scraps, that they were in fact a kind of sequence of poems, and that they were all around this theme of what is it to be a woman? Mm. And that was the evolution of the long poem called Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, which I wrote in the early 60s. Mm-hmm. But I had so much self-doubt as a poet in those years, and I thought I'd stopped being a poet, but I couldn't stop writing poetry.
How did being Jewish enter that whole sort of construction of yourself as well as the work?
As a child, I grew up in a very assimilated world, mm-hmm. and there wasn't a great deal being said about that. And this was, of course, during the 1930s and 1940s, mm-hmm. When being Jewish was at a very charged point in history, mm-hmm. If it ever isn't. And, you know, when I think back on it, actually, that generation that I was, 16 years old in 1945, the end of the war, the newsreels coming out of the death camps, going downtown in Baltimore to see those newsreels by myself, because in some way I knew my parents wouldn't want me to go. Mm-hmm. And
so their responses at this time was to
Basically, to keep quiet about it. Keep quiet about it. A strategy of if you don't make trouble, trouble won't come looking for you.
But it does, doesn't
But
it?
of course it does, and it's a mistaken strategy. But,
Absolutely.
those images, you know, from those first newsreels, I think just stayed with me forever as a part of my life.
To hate this, they must have been dragged through the manzanilla, spitting out the last spun syllables for cruelty. New sound forming, pushing towards lips made to bubble blood. This road could match that. Hard bitten on mangrove and wild bush, the sea wind heaving any remnants of consonant curses into choking aspirate. No language is neutral, seared in the spine's unraveling. Here is history too. A backbone bending and unbending without a word. Heat bellowing these lungs, spongy exhaled and humming the ocean a way out, and not anything of beauty. Dipping turquoise and scandalous. Concretely, what I think I'm doing when I am writing poetry is I think that I am speaking to Black people, and particularly those people that share the same kind of history as I do, because history is a very present and real thing in my life. And also history is not some all-controlling thing either. We're making it every day, so we can change it every day. And I guess that's the other important note in that, making those lines up, to say that we change history every day by the way that we act.
When you say that you're writing for Black people...
Or to them.
To them.
Yeah.
How do you feel about being overheard?
I concentrate on the one hearing. Mm-hmm. So that if anyone else hears it, then I am pleased, sure, do you know? But in terms of crafting that line, I must speak to the hearer, and the hearer I've identified, the task that I've identified is this hearer who must hear it out of the history of colonialism and slavery and continued kind of oppression in the world as we know it today. And whoever overhears, hopefully, because I've overheard other places. Mm-hmm. I've also been forced to hear. You know, I mean, I've had my unwillingly been trained to hear other things too. So I figure whoever wants to come in can come in. And you know, at times I don't even really care about the interpretation that they make of it. What I do care about is the interpretation that the hearer that I'm speaking to hears, what the hearer hears of it. You know, what Black people hear me say. Mm-hmm. That's really crucial. That's when I know I've made the poem. How to fly gravity, how to balance basket and prose reaching for murder. Silence done curse God and beauty here. People does hear things in this heliconia piece, a morphology of rolling chain and copper gong now shape this twang, falsettos of whip and air rudiment this grammar. Take what I tell you. When these barracks held slaves between their stone halters, talking was left for night, and hush was idiom and hot core.
What incredible distortion of the mind and heart goes on for the people who are living there. The masters, the colonists who are living there alongside such enormous suffering, and to be able to do that what they have to do to themselves and what they have to do to their own ways of seeing and what they have to do to their own inner knowledge and their own hearts. And that's a part of history. It's a part of the history of the oppressor that is very rarely talked about. Not only what the oppressor does to those who he can subjugate, but also what he and she are doing to themselves.
Yeah. Toni Morrison talks about that we often talk about what happened to black people enslaved and people who were victims of oppression. But she says it's something like what happens to the hand that pours the acid? You know, what does that hand look like?
And we're still working out of that history.
Oh, absolutely.
With both parts of it.
Yeah.
This week I've dredged my pages for anything usable, head, heart, perforated by raw disgust and fear. If I dredge up anything, it's suffused by what it works in, like the dyer's hand. I name it unsteady, slick, unworthy, and I go on. In my 65th year, I know something about language. It can eat or be eaten by experience. Maeve, poetry means refusing the choice to kill or die. But this life of continuing is for the sane mad and the bravest monsters. It really isn't that one just has this secret, illicit pleasure in making poetry or making, art, and feels guilty about it. But I think if you have that pleasure, if you have that joy of creativity, and you've been allowed to have it in a society like, yours or mine, you want it for everyone. You really want it for there as a possibility for anyone who might have that desire.
In another place, not here, a woman might touch something between beauty and nowhere, back there and here, might pass hand over hand her own trembling life. But I have tried to imagine a sea not bleeding, a girl's glance full as a verse, a woman growing old and never crying to a radio hissing of a black boy's murder. I have tried to keep my throat gurgling like a bird's. I have listened to the hard gossip of race that inhabits this road. Even in this, I have tried to hum mud and feathers and sit peacefully in this foliage of bones and rain. I have chewed a few votive leaves here, their taste already disenchanting my mother's. I have tried to write this thing calmly, even as its lines burn to a close. I have come to know something simple. Each sentence, realized or dreamed, jumps like a pulse with history and takes a side. What I say, in any language, is told in faultless knowledge of skin. I just always had a real love for the sound of things. That's the simplest way I could tell it.
you.